Well, hey, welcome, viewers. I obviously have Jacob here with me. Many of you know who he is already. So, hey, Jacob, so good to already talk with you a little bit this morning.
Yeah.
We are right in the middle of the fall feast days, and if you just need a little bit of catch up, you have Yom Teruah, or the Day of Shouting, or Feast of Trumpets, on Tishri 1. Tishri is just code word for in Hebrew for the 7th month, and then you have that first day. So you have Feast of Trumpets. Sorry, I couldn't get it out of my head. So Feast of Trumpets, and then 10 days later, you have Yom Kippurim, and we have just observed that. And then you have 5 days later, you have the first day of Feast of Tabernacles. And we are right in the middle of Tabernacles. I have a sukkah out in my backyard, and Jacob also has a sukkah. Do you call it a side yard, a backyard? What is it on farmland? I don't even know. What do you call it in the homestead?
I'll just be hickish. We'll call it the back 40. No, it's actually just right out. That's
fair enough. So we are in the middle of Sukkot 2021, and coming up real quick on, let's see, September 2021 on the 29th. At sundown, that will begin the observance of Shemini Atzeret, which is the 8th day. And so what you would do is you would take off on the 30th, and that is basically all the intro we need. So here we are, Jacob, right here in the middle of Sukkot, and we're talking about Sukkot, 8th day. Kind of put it in. You've told me some stuff already, Jacob, and I want our listeners to hear this. This is really goosebumpy. So enjoy.
Yeah. So it's just one of those things where, and I'm pulling it up here on my scriptures just to kind of have it for the main punchline. But what we have been doing, we have our sukkah out back, and my son, he's out there just loving it. He's actually out there sleeping right now in it. And he and I have been camping out every night. And my wife she was in there first couple nights, but the animals all go off, and she's a light sleeper. So she sleeps in there for a couple hours, and then she's got to kind of throw in the towel, because the chickens go off, or the goats go off, and then the dogs go off, and she's a light sleeper. So
I'm with her. I totally get it.
So we've all been out there, and it's just been a wonderful experience. We've been cooking our food over a cowboy kitchen out there. Mm-hmm. So we haven't been doing indoor cooking at nighttime. So we did a brisket. I did a brisket over the open flame last night.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and it's just a ton of fun, enjoy some good food. We did before, but we're going to be doing a chicken tonight over the flame, and it's just a blast. We get to reap the fruit, if you will, of our labor throughout the year. And so, but there's some stuff that, as I come to Sukkot, this is going to be my 4th Sukkot keeping Torah, and there's some things that I had a really good, strong, quote unquote, evangelical theology going into Torah. So there was a lot of things that benefited me. It's all about Yeshua. And also, I want to qualify that, because Yeshua himself, I would think, and he has said, it's really about the Father. It's about bringing glory to the Father. It's about Father being greater than I am. And yes, the Father and the Son, everything the Father has is the Son's, and everything the Son has is the Father's. But the Son, in everything he does, seeks to honor and glorify the Father. But the good evangelical theology that I did have was that the scriptures are all about pointing to Mashiach, and they would say, Jesus Christ, but it's all about Yeshua HaMashiach. In that, it's about the word of God is pointing to him as the word incarnate. So I see things in the scriptures that potentially somebody coming from an exclusive Jewish background, who is learning that Yeshua is the Messiah, or let's say a completely pagan background, no. And by that I mean not disparaging, but a complete, in this context, completely ignorant of the scripture,
Right.
of Messiah, anything like that. There is an advantage of being able to see Yeshua in almost everything in the scriptures, is what I really have enjoyed coming to Torah, and even more deep, life-changing way, because I see my Messiah in everything in the scriptures. And so as we come to, or in the midst of Sukkot, one of the things that's really struck me is that, yes, we are to celebrate this feast as a remembrance of the children of Israel coming out of Egypt and living in the wilderness,
Right.
in booths. That's why it's a remembrance of a past event. But there is something deeper there. And I had this conversation, I celebrated with Gary and Sharon on the first day of Sukkot this year. And there was some musings I had with them, just talking about them, because they got such a depth of knowledge. So I when I have some ideas, I oftentimes will bounce that off of them, just to make sure I'm not in complete heresy, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's safe to speculate and bounce. That's why it really does take a community to theologize. Now, before you share this story, some of the things that you have said that have hit me that I think it's important for any listener to hear is, imagine just reading an instruction book indefinitely and never actually going out and assembling your barbecue, or never actually going out and just doing the thing that you're studying up on. Too often in the evangelical world, we equate discipleship with a quiet time and Bible study. That's got to stop at some point, in the sense that don't stop doing Bible study, but it's got to stop in thinking that if you are reading the scriptures and you are not doing what it asks you to do, you are really missing out on a huge formative experience. And the thing is that you're highlighting is, in your evangelical background, you had a lot of this knowledge. So there's a lot of people that are really adept at scriptures. They know about the feast days. They know about how Yeshua began to fulfill those spring feast days. They know all this, but their shepherds continue to tell them to not press into the narrative by doing the observances themselves, that somehow...
Yeah. I mean, to use a, you'll get this, the viewers won't, but that's okay. To use an autoism, a Barryism, an autoism. It's like having the passion of, a V8 engine and having it in the wrong frame of a car, like trying to fit it in a Volkswagen Bug, right? Like,
Yeah.
you can't do it, but the passion's there. But once I had Torah, it was like, I can throw this thing in a Camaro now, or I could throw this thing in a Boss Mustang or whatnot, if I wanted to go with a V8 and a Mustang. But like throwing a V8 in a Camaro and finally having like it being able to drive this thing to its max potential, like knowing like this is how it should feel.
Yeah.
This is what it is supposed to be like. So this Sukkot, before even coming to Torah, I had never heard of Sukkot. I've heard of Feast of Tabernacles, but only in passing, right?
Oh, right. Yeah.
So one of the things that over the last couple of years that's really sunk in is, and I'm going to allow myself to interrupt myself. This musing that I'm about to go into, I have no intention of trying to elicit controversy when it comes to the age of the earth. That's not the goal of this. I'm not planning on teaching on that. I just accept the Bible for what it says in the framework and how the biblical authors, under the inspiration of the Spirit, recount what the Spirit is unctioning them and inspiring them to write down.
Right.
So I say all that to say this. We're coming to the close of the feast cycle. This feast is 7 days. And you have Shemini Atzeret is on the end, but it's distinct from the 7 days of Sukkot, but it's not distinct. It's like this bleeding over in effect, because you're still kind of in Sukkot, but there's something, as Gary pointed out in the podcast y'all did last week, there's something distinct about it, and that's the Mikra HaKodesh. Sukkot only has one Mikra HaKodesh, and then Shemini Atzeret has its own Mikra HaKodesh, or Holy Convocation. And something that struck me as I was like thinking, I go, okay, this is supposed to be a remembrance about the Israelites being in the wilderness, dwelling in booths. But they did that for 40 years. They didn't do it for 7 years. They didn't do it for 7 days. They didn't do it for 70 years. They didn't do it for 70 weeks. So the thing that struck me was, okay, Yahweh could have made this time frame as long as he wanted to make it, right? That's just kind of, and so I'm thinking in my head, I'm going, okay, the 7 doesn't line up with anything.
Yeah.
So what gives? And the thing that was the what gives moment was, I noticed that with unleavened bread too. And I thought, okay, well, the Israelites didn't eat unleavened bread for 7 years. They didn't eat it for 7 days.
Right.
Right. In the context of, they had manna for 40 years. Right. So they come out of Egypt. So I know that, and people say, well, they did eat unleavened bread for 7 days. They did, but there's something else going on. And we've talked about this in previous podcasts, where what's really taking place is you're getting Egypt out of you. Right.
Yeah.
And so that took 40 years. Right. It took 40 years for that old generation to die out.
Right.
So for that leaven to get out. So I thought again, okay, so on the front end, you've got Passover that leads into 7 days unleavened bread. And on the back end, you've got Sukkot, 7 days leading into an 8th day. So there's this structuring, right? You have a 8-day thing kind of going up front, and you have an 8-day thing kind of going on the back, but it's really 7. And then there's these ones. And so what's going on? And so I questioned, well, or just thought rather, if we assume, or I'm going to make an assumption that this appears to be based on the literal 6-day creation model with the 7th day Shabbat. This is my opinion. There's nothing in scripture that explicitly states that. But this is, I think Yahweh puts things there. It's the glory of God to conceal a matter, and it's the glory of kings to discover it, right? Is what the paraphrasing of the proverb. So basically, God concealed these things, and it's the glory of kings to figure out what has God concealed? What's this mystery? Why did Yahweh do it this way? Because there's a purpose behind it. Yahweh doesn't do things frivolously. He does things very intentionally. So I thought to myself, this has got to be basing everything upon the 7-day creation model. 6 days creation, 1 day Shabbat. And then I thought, okay, if we take that, let's just tinker with it. Peter says 1 day, all he's doing is quoting the Psalms, by the way. Peter says 1 day is 1,000 years, 1,000 years is a day to Yahweh. Okay. So he's not slow in keeping his promise, as some count slowness. He's patient with you, not willing that any should perish. So I thought, okay, the 7 days of unleavened bread in that context would mean that you have, for all 7,000 years of the creation that is going to exist, we are supposed to be living an unleavened life that is not polluted or stained by the world.
Mm-hmm.
There is I think, something really deep in this idea, as we previously discussed. My wife makes bread, that you can leaven the bread without any leavening agent because it actually brings in the leaven from the air.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the enemy is the prince of the powers of the air. He's the prince of this world. So there's a Pharaoh comparison, there's an Egypt comparison there, where you have to intentionally not allow this stuff to get in. Okay. Now, on the back end, Sukkot, that's where we're at now. 7 days, 7,000 years. This earth as it is temporary. And if you were to count from the biblical chronology, best estimates, the Hebrew year right now is 5782. Mm-hmm. So that's according to Hebrew reckoning. I think that's off by 250 years personally. And that's because I think that the chronology in the Septuagint, which is backed up by the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is backed up by Josephus, is more accurate. So again, this is my opinion, not going to get into the argument. So the point is, we're right at about that 6,000 year mark. Okay, we're getting there. Now, what does this have to do with Sukkot? Well, this whole time frame for the last 6,000 years, all Christians know this is, and before that, the writer of Hebrews says, this is not our home. The hall of faith is filled with people who recognize that this is temporary and that we are looking forward to a city with foundations whose builder is God. So this is the hope of the faithful, is looking forward to a permanent, but until that permanent comes, we live in this tent of the body, right? That's what Peter says. Paul, I don't think any coincidence, he's a tent maker. He was a tent maker, right?
Yeah.
So isn't that interesting? He's a tent maker.
It is interesting.
So this idea that 7,000 years or 6,000 years has been temporary, and people will say, well, Jacob, the resurrection takes place and we have our permanent bodies. Zechariah and the prophets seem to indicate, I think, explicitly indicate that there are going to be people, specifically Zechariah, that are not glorified, that are going to be living during the millennial kingdom. And if that is true, now you have people that are still in temporary dwellings.
Mm-hmm.
So even in the millennium, as Messiah takes over the reins, right, he has the kingdom conferred upon him and he builds it, an establishment. There, Isaiah tells us there's no end to the increase.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we who are glorified in the resurrection, Yeshua says, we don't get married. We're not given in marriage. We are like, and it's a comparison, we are like the angels in heaven. So we become glorified. So the procreation thing ends for the glorified saints. So how can his kingdom continue to increase? How are babies born into this context? You'd have to have unglorified people that survived the Great Tribulation and are now a part of the kingdom. They weren't a part of the beast system, and for whatever reason, Yahweh allows them to live, and this is in order to fulfill his covenant promises to Israel and to Judah. So there's this increase going on. So those people at that time during the millennium, they're going to be living in temporary tents too. They're not going to be glorified.
Yeah.
So it's a 7,000 year period until 1 Corinthians 15 takes over and the Son turns everything over to the Father. then at that point, there is no more temporary dwellings. You are either a part of the first resurrection, or you're a part of the second resurrection, and it was in a good way. That maybe and I don't know exactly how this works living during the millennium, because it's not something any of us experience. I don't know if righteous people just live really long and then still would die, or if they live the whole millennium and then they're glorified. I don't know how this ultimately works.
Good
I
thought.
just know that there's a first resurrection and there's a second resurrection. That's what it says. And we are told, blessed and holy is the one who takes place in the first resurrection. Over then the second death has no power. So it's not a double jeopardy for the first resurrection. So my point is, you have this Feast of Sukkot that also, like Feast of Unleavened Bread, seems to have an intentional 7-day sequence mirroring the creation time frame itself. So Yahweh creates in 6 days, 7 days Shabbat. There's going to be 6,000 years of human labor, 1,000 year Shabbat.
Yeah.
And you get these two pictures up front. So the message up front is keep yourself unstained by the world. The picture at the end is remember that this life is temporary. So it's a call to endurance. Almost is my observation, just kind of thinking about it now, is it's a reminder. Endure to the end is Yeshua's exhortation to the 7 churches. To the one who conquers, Nakao occurs 7 times in the context of to the one who conquers, I will give this. So there's a reward. So this idea of Yahweh giving his saints, his chosen people, a clear indication, in my opinion, guys, gals, this is all temporary. In light of this, in light of the understanding that this life is temporary and we look forward to the city with foundations, to the resurrection, Peter's exhortation in 2 Peter chapter 3 is, knowing all this, going through the day of the Lord, all that kind of jazz, what kind of people ought you to be? What kind of people ought you to be in light of the fact that you should keep yourself unstained by the world, and knowing this life is temporary?
Yeah.
How ought you conduct yourselves? Well, in the feast cycle itself, we're given this grand indication. What are the feasts organized around? They are all organized around yielding a harvest. All of them. And you'll say, well, Jacob, not you, but people might say, well, Passover and unleavened bread aren't really based around a harvest. Yeah, first fruits kind of is, but what's going on there? You don't even know how to count the month in the Hebrew calendar until you get that the month of Av. When you're looking up for that Aviv, that first little sheath to show you what month it is, and that determines whether or not there's 13 months in the calendar or 12 months in the calendar.
So our viewers might not know what Aviv, what does that mean?
Why don't you?
So Aviv just means ripe. It's ripening, a ripe. And so the first month there means ripe. The Sanhedrin would have gone out and determined that it's the barley. Was it the barley, right? I think it's the barley.
The barley, yeah. It's the barley first.
Yeah, the barley's ripe, and then they could determine when that next new moon would happen. So yeah, it's all centered around this harvest time stuff.
So Yeshua makes a comment. He says that he's the Lord of the harvest. Isn't that an interesting comment? He's the Lord of the harvest, and the entire feast cycle is built around the expectation of reaping a harvest.
Yeah.
That's the whole. So that's the other thing I didn't tell you before when we were doing our little pre-podcast brief, is the whole feast cycle is based upon this expectation there's going to be an initial harvest, Messiah, the first fruits. There's anticipation of a second harvest, the Feast of Weeks at Shavuot, the main gathering, or
Right.
the second initial gathering, and then the big harvest
Yeah,
at
on
the
this,
end.
I'm not a conspiracy theory type guy, but when you talk about, and this is an ancillary thing, but we've gone into, we had the Industrial Revolution, we have all this processed food. One of the subtle things that I think Satan has actually done is removed people from the land, from the
Oh,
seasons,
that's
from,
interesting.
it's just this subtle, how do I get people removed from the earth's natural, and that's the thing, is God set it all up to create this
Mhm.
picture that we are to live into. And so even I think we feel it most right now with science being our God, where everyone's thinking,
Yeah.
well, this is what the science says, this is what the science says. And I'm just telling you, people, I'm no conspiracy theorist, but at the same time, I do see evil work happening in how God created our creation to proclaim the glory of our Messiah. And we've become more and more distant. And one of the things that Jacob knows is, as we observe the feast days and we are, cognizant of kosher and all that stuff, it has put us back into a modality of observing just Yahweh's creation, and it helps us, I think. So I had to do
For
that
me,
little.
living on my homestead, I learn. Like, I still think there's once we get back into gardening more, because
Mhm.
we kind of took a back seat to gardening. This year is just way too busy. But with just raising animals and understanding the Torah more and more in light of caring for those animals, I understand why there's certain commandments now. Never understood why, but in the your way, being in an agricultural agrarian context makes the scriptures explode from the pages, because you get the references, right? You don't have to do all the historical contextualization and go, well, what's a plow? Well, what's a barley? There's these things. What's leaven? I'd like to know how many people in America make their own bread anymore, right? So when you remove people from these practices, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, tinfoil hat person either, but I think you bring up a good point. And Paul says we are not unaware of his schemes. I can't help but wonder if you're right in that would be a compelling conjectural argument that we have been removed really in the last 300 years from what was the status quo for the last 5,500 years.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an enormous. I mean, we don't necessarily know how high technology peaked prior to the flood. It could have been pretty advanced. We don't really know, because it was all destroyed. But the reality is, yeah, the more anything that the enemy can do to try to make the scriptures not make sense, my assumption he's going to try and go for it.
Oh yeah. So it's
I
not.
think it's a fair conjectural
Yeah.
argument.
Not make sense, and also remove you from the patterns that He has given us.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. When you're removed from the pattern, I mean, here's another one, and this isn't supposed to be an in-depth teaching today. This is more just like what it is every time we podcast. Two
That's what
friends just
podcasts
kind
are.
of chit-chatting over, coffee or tea, whatever you got over there, and um, having a blast. But here's another thing that I noticed. So removing us from the patterns for a really long time. I don't know exactly how long, but for a really long time, I would say probably 4,000 years. Most civilizations operated off of a lunar calendar. A good chunk I mean, China to this day has the lunar New Year, right? A lot of Asiatic cultures operate off of the sequence of the moon. It was only relatively new to, I mean, Rome operated off of a solar calendar. So that's when the West really started to move in a solar calendar direction. Obviously, you had like the Celts and stuff like that, but a good chunk of society operated off of a lunar calendar. So they were following the movements of the moon with particular interest. We don't do that anymore. We live in a largely time devoid society now. People work with technology. We have lights all the time because we have power. So there's no more candlelight grind. It's you can work until 5 a.m. and sleep during the day. Like there's the sense of time itself is really a nebulous thing now. Mm-hmm. It's not structured. It's very amorphous. It's not concrete. And why do I bring that up? Well, coming back into Torah, you and I talked about this a couple weeks ago, is being very mindful of where that moon is. So here's a catch that I hadn't mused on, and maybe there's something to it. My opinion is that the moon is supposed to be a teaching element, item for Messiah, for Yeshua, and how it radiates the glory of the Father represented by the Son. And it gives light in the darkness, right? And this is what John's theology was. The light has shone in the darkness, and the darkness has not understood it. Mm-hmm. Genesis chapter 1, there's two lights, one to govern the day and one to govern the night. All the prophets, not all the prophets, but a good chunk of the prophets speak of waiting for the dawn to come. There is no dawn for the wicked. Malachi says, but you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings. So there's this idea that we're living in a present darkness, okay? And that we're anticipating this new dawn. So when I look at the feast cycles, I notice that you have first day of unleavened bread, Passover, occurs on the 14th, 15th, right? Mm-hmm. On a lunar calendar, that is when the moon is going to be at or near full every single time.
Yep.
You have the sliver shows up at Yom Teruah.
Right.
It's waxing at Yom Kippurim, and it's again reaching its peak or right in that window around the 15th of Tishri, which is when Sukkot kicks off.
Yep.
Now, here's the interesting thing. If the sun himself is being represented, if you will, by the moon as a teaching instrument by Yahweh himself for us to have a point of reference,
right?
The sun is on full, or the moon is at its fullest radiance at 2 times during the feast cycle. During the Passover and unleavened bread, we see the sun in his first coming on full display.
Yeah.
The glory of the suffering servant. You want to see what glory, true glory is? This is true glory. To lay down your life for sinners when you yourself were righteous and did nothing wrong. Living a perfect life and redeeming mankind who rebelled against you. Because don't forget, Yeshua is the one. Let me get my theology right. The Son is the one who created, working with the Father. So your creations that are rebellion against you, what's the Son's response? I'm going to die for it.
Yeah.
The glory in that, the moon in full display, that's a teaching point.
Yeah.
Now we're at Sukkot. What's occurred? You see the sun come back, Yeshua come back on the 1st of Tishri, whenever that is. And you see this waxing as he's conquering until finally the kingdom is firmly in his hand and he executes judgment on the 10th. And then what do you see in all of its glory?
The beginning of Sukkot.
The beginning of Sukkot and what humanity should have been and is going to be, all because of the conquering king. So there's the glory is bookended on both sides.
Right.
So that you see this is the glory of servitude of our King, the suffering servant, I should say, because I don't want to mix analogies. You have the glory of the suffering servant and you have the glory of the righteous King. These are the two things that Yahweh, I think, has intentionally put at those places. Because again, he could make the feast days any day he wants. He could have made the feast days of the first of the month, all of them, right?
Yeah.
He could have made them all Yom Teruahs, but he doesn't do that. So my question is, when I take a look at these, it makes me go, why didn't he do that? There's got to be a reason he did that, because that's just the way my brain works. I'm analytical. So I'm wondering, why did he do it this way? So now, this is the building to the cool part that I shared with you before when we were doing our initial talking, prep for the podcast. If you have these two feasts, these two outliers, they're kind of like 8 days each. Passover goes into Unleavened Bread, Sukkot goes into Shemini Atzeret.
So explain that though. If you have on the Passover one, why is that 8 days?
So the Passover lamb is killed on the 14th.
Okay.
But unleavened bread starts on the 15th.
Okay. Yep.
Sukkot starts on the 15th and it ends, but it goes directly into Shemini Atzeret after that 7th day. Does that make sense?
For me, yes. I think it makes sense for everybody. Yes.
Okay. So the question is, and I'm having a little bit of internet. I just want to make sure you're okay over there. Can you still hear me?
We can hear you. Are we seeing everything? No, but keep going.
Okay. Okay. So just acknowledging the technical difficulties here being in the country. So if you have an 8-day front end and you have an 8-day back end, I wonder why he did it like that. And so the musing I have is this. If the 7 days are indicative of the 7,000 years of creation, that would mean that Yeshua, the Passover lamb, is slain before the foundation of the world.
Did you hear that? And that's the goosebumpy part for me.
Right? So here's the thing. If I pull up here in my scriptures in Revelation 13, this is in the context of the beast's kingdom, right? It says, all on the earth, I'm in verse 8, and all who dwell on earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the life of the Lamb who was slain.
Yeah, so here we have right here in the feast day cycle, we have that Passover lamb being slain right before the unleavened bread feast kicks off. So it's before that foundation.
Yeah. It's before the world is even created.
This is a holy smokes.
Yeah. This is something that I just was like, wait a minute. Is that what's going on? And I think it is. I think that's exactly what's being conveyed, is that what it does is it indicates this is the plan of God.
Yeah.
This lamb is going to be slain. I am going to enter into this creation narrative knowing full and well I've signed my own death warrant. I mean, that's what's, I am willingly, this is the attitude of the Son. I am going to, the Father and Son working together, the Son, I am going to lay down my life for the creation. I know this is the plan.
Okay, so
and the Father's good with it.
Well, yeah. Okay, so what we have here is you have this sort of chiastic structure. And at the very beginning, before the feast days and effectually kick off in the spring, we have the Passover lamb, Yeshua slain before the foundation of the world. But then on the other end of this bookend, you're talking about this 8th day. I'm going to read the exact scripture because I think that sometimes people miss it. So here I am in Leviticus 23, verse 36, and it's tough because I think if you blink, you'll miss it. For 7 days you shall present an offering by fire to the Lord on the 8th day. So this is in the context of the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot. On the 8th day you shall have a holy convocation and present an offering by fire to the Lord. It is an assembly. You shall not do any laborious work. So you're referring to this. It's basically one verse. And I know in Judaism, they refer to this day of, they're not even really sure what it's about. What is it? What's going on? But believers...
I think Gary's called it like the day about absolutely nothing.
Yeah, right. But if you're a Christian, if you know about our Messiah and what's unfolding in Revelation, we know.
So, and even if Yeshua, and there's no ifs, because you and I proved this in one of the previous podcasts. And by the way, not a lot of views on that one. Guys, that one's a really important one because it not because I'm saying anything particularly insightful or Traver saying anything particularly insightful. Y'all need to know that there's a specific time frame that the crucifixion happened. And when you get that time frame right, the amount of theological implications are massive. If Yeshua is raised on the first fruits, right? If he's raised after the Shabbat on the first day of the week, which is what everybody's in agreement on, Messianic, Torah observant, quote unquote, believers, and your evangelical Christians, everybody's in agreement he was raised on the quote unquote first day of the week. Nobody's arguing about that. Everybody's in complete agreement about that on the main bell curve. So, but the inference is if you make the understanding that, oh yeah, I know he was resurrected on Sunday, that's missing the point, that you're not getting it. The point is he's raised on the first day of the week, which would mean that it's technically the 8th day because you go through a full 7-day cycle.
Yep.
And then he's resurrected. And here's the kicker. He's resurrected at, in my opinion, because the Shabbat ends at sundown on what we call Saturday. Well, the women show up at the tomb early in the morning. He's not there. So he's resurrected right after the Sabbath. He's not there in the morning. They're fully anticipating to be here. And the angels are like, sorry, ladies.
Right.
He's not here. He hasn't been here. He's risen.
You know, on this, we know that scripturally there is nothing that takes the Sabbath and moves it to the first day of the week. It's not in there. Any theologian is going to tell you that. What happened is in the early church days, the church fathers, the patristics, they decided that the day that Yeshua resurrected, and rightly so, and that is what they would call the 8th day back then. We get that part, but we should never have changed it from the 7th day to the 8th day. And what happens with believers is we have such a one-dimensional faith in the sense that everyone wants to live and think about the 8th day. Everyone wants to click on anything that's going to tell me about the end times. And, oh, the 8th day's coming, the 8th day's coming, the millennial kingdom's coming, and everyone gets excited about this, and we rightfully should. But we should also rightfully not forget the rest of the feast day cycle and everything that else Yahweh has told us, because you can't always, let's anticipate the future, but we do ourselves a huge disservice as believers to not know the rest of the story and have, and what's going to happen. We look forward to the 8th day with so much more anticipation if we know and live into the rest of the story.
Well, and it gives a sense of one of the most, well, allow me to finish the...
Yeah, I'm sorry, and I get passionate.
No, you're good, because I think we'll come back to it in the final 10, 15 minutes here, because this is a pretty quick punchline. So Sukkot being 7 days bleeds into this 8th day. This is when Yeshua turns the kingdom over to the Father. This is after Satan's final defeat, and this is eternity. So what you have portrayed in the feast cycles, and remember, Israel's constantly portrayed as what? This idea of the master Yeshua's parables. You know, there was a piece of land, and the master put a wall in it. He put a press in it. He he planted trees and all these crops. He comes expecting harvest.
Mm-hmm.
The land the earth belongs to Yahweh. Okay. So stepping in from eternity, the plan is the lamb is going to be slain. I anticipate, and here's the crazy thing is the floating day of Feast of First Fruits comes on, well, I don't want to get too sidetracked, but you have the first fruit comes in, and I can't help but wonder if you were to actually place the way that Yeshua, how first fruits fell, and these ideas of you have like Abraham, and then it goes to Sinai, and then it goes to Yeshua's arrival, and then it comes to his second coming.
Mm-hmm.
These things, they're kind of like Yahweh expects a harvest. And he's going to eventually at the end bring everything into his barn. I go to prepare a place for you. In my Father's house are many moni, abiding places. So you step in from eternity, and then at the end of the feast cycle, you step into eternity. So you're coming out of eternity into time,
Yeah.
and then you're stepping out of time into eternity. So that for the believer, you're called to endure this period of time, and with the understanding that it is temporary and that you have work to do while you're on this earth. And by the way, Yeshua says in Revelation 2 and 3, it's to the one who conquers.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't, oh, well, I believe all the oxen free, I can do whatever I want. That's not what he says at all. In fact, it doesn't say that in the Gospels either. In fact, none of the apostolic authors say that either. And if you think Paul says that, you should probably read Paul again. Because Paul is very clear on the front end of Romans that do we therefore nullify this law by this faith? By no means. We uphold the law. But then people want to go all the way to the back of Romans and say, if you believe with your mouth that Jesus is the Lord and God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. And completely forget everything Paul said about.
Yeah, disregards the first
the law,
9 chapters.
5 chapters. Yeah, 5 chapters earlier. You're reading that in Romans 3. So this is the musings that I've had that I think are these deeper things that Yahweh gives us in his feasts that are so critically important once you really step into the scriptures and really start thinking analytically, which is what we're supposed to do. Don't cheapen your faith. For the listeners and the viewers, don't cheapen your faith. This is a precious pearl, and it is worth giving up everything to have this pearl. So wonderful that you give all that you have for the pearl. It's a pearl of great price because it's an incalculable treasure. And isn't it curious that of all the gemstones, the only one that is born out of the suffering of a living entity is the pearl? Gemstones are formed out of pressure, heat and pressure, time, heat, time, pressure. Topaz, amethyst, diamond, ruby, sapphire, all of them, emeralds, they're formed from pressure, time, and heat, but not the pearl. The pearl is born of the suffering of that oyster, of that clam, whatever officially the pearl comes from. A little speck of sand gets there and cuts and wounds that entity. And what grows out of it is born of the suffering of the animal, and it produces a precious treasure. And there is no coincidence. Talking about the 8th day going into it, and then we'll have a final discussion. The gates of the New Jerusalem, what are they made out of?
Single pearl?
Each gate is made out of a single pearl. And they have names on them of those who suffered. And so you only enter into the kingdom through suffering. But that suffering produces an incalculable treasure, one that will endure for all of eternity. That's what's going on, and why he uses the analogy of the pearl versus something else. So guys, we enter into the kingdom. The prosperity gospel is dead. There's an irony in that statement, because the emperor doesn't have clothes. People continue to suffer. Good people that I know that follow after Yahweh, that get sick, that get cancer, that die, that love Yeshua very much. And yet, this isn't their, well, I don't want to take a swipe, I'll be tactful. This is not potentially the life they had hoped for. Not necessarily the life that they would have chosen. But it's the life they have, and Yahweh allows them to go through it. Same way He allowed Job to go through it. I got news for you folks. Yeshua didn't live and suffer and die for you to have a comfortable life in this life.
Yeah.
His death, burial, and resurrection is the instrument by which you enter into eternal life. And the glory of the servant is the glory of the suffering servant. And we're no different in this. But knowing that this life is transitory, and this is the good news, moving on from, oh, that's really heavy, is this is temporary and our resurrection is coming. So live this life. Live in this Feast of Sukkot. Go into your Sukkah and remind yourself this life is temporary.
You know,
and one day it's going to be permanent with the Father and the Son.
On this topic, so you're going to, I know you're going to talk more about the 8th day here and the bookends, and you know, part of what I have studied a long time is this frog in the kettle concept, and essentially what Satan does to, and when I mentioned before about the Industrial Revolution and such, part of the interesting thing about the development in the West, in even our U.S. Constitution, hey, I'm all about freedom. I'm all about freedom of speech. But one of the things that John Locke came up with was this idea of, hey, let anyone say anything they want. And people feel good about saying, and going to social media, people feel good about saying. But the problem is that John Locke knew that as long as people could say whatever they wanted, but not do whatever they wanted, you could rule over them. And one of the things that I'm seeing as we move closer and closer to this end time situation is that we have believers that believe hard, believe, and there's no obedience involved in that. You cannot go to a church service for 1 hour on the weekend and think that you're dialed in. It doesn't work that way. That essentially amounts to nothing. You go to church, you go about the rest of your week, and if you're living just like the world and you are not pressing into the obediences that Yahweh has given us, essentially you're a non-entity to Satan, you are a non-entity to our government, and they will continue to control you. If you really, really want to be on the kingdom trajectory, in the sense of you live your life in a way that is of the pattern of the kingdom and not of the world, even Yeshua said you will be persecuted. Why will you be persecuted? Because when you get out of this realm of we're all, Jacob and I admit that we're saved by grace through faith, not of our works, but we do press into these works because as we do them, I guarantee you will be persecuted. And at some point, the powers that be will turn up the heat on that persecution because it will not allow you to go along with the world's ways. And so I'm just letting you know that if your life is too cushy, especially going into end time stuff, you might want to do a little gut check, because the things of God will be antithetical to the things of the world. And if you're not feeling that heat, it's a word to the wise that living into Yahweh's kingdom via obedience, whether it be to the feast days or the rest of the statutes, judgments, commandments, these are the things that are going to put you into a situation where you will feel a bit of the heat. Now, Jacob and I at some point in the future are going to talk about second Exodus and the protection of our God and what might occur during those times. So I don't want to go too far into the doldrums in the sense that our God it's going to take care of those who are faithful. But at the same time, when I say that, we've not been there, we don't know, and there will be hardship, and there will be potentially death for folks. But I'll stop that for now. I just think you bring up such a good point on this prosperity gospel thing. Now we've got about I'd say 7-8 minutes here, Jacob.
Sure.
Take us full circle on this 8th day thing, and what are your last comments on this topic?
Well, last comments on this is it is, and I say this in hope, knowing that he will bring it to completion, is that no eye has seen, no ear has heard what God has planned for those who love him and are called according to his purposes. Now, some people might apply that to this present life, but that kind of defeats the point of the statement, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
If no eye has seen, no ear has heard.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if that's what he has planned for those who love him, means that nobody on this planet at any point, except the Son, has any understanding, including Paul, who wrote that, has any concept of what is coming. And that what's even more incredible is, despite the perfect reign of Messiah during the millennium, there's still something better coming after that. I mean, if this is the thing, is like, yeah, we're going to have the resurrection and we're going to be ruling and reigning with Messiah for 1,000 years. But quote the song, I'm blanking on the name of the song, but it's a baby ain't seen nothing yet. Like it's like there's this thing that it's like maybe almost the appropriate context of like Messiah saying to his bride, baby, you ain't seen nothing yet. Like this is like he doesn't even allow, because there will still be disobedience in the millennium and Messiah will have to adjudicate it. It's like the Father doesn't even want those people to have a taste of what's going to come.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, no, this is something, it's the way the wedding night should be. Like, you don't really get to enjoy it until you're married, is the way it's meant to be. Until you're fully into the family, then you get to enjoy it. It's like, no, you don't even get a taste of how good this is going to be. If all of our longing, all of our hope, all of our affections are on Messiah right now, waiting for him to come back, and that same Messiah says, the Father's greater than I, if we can't even stand, if the prophets and saints, when they see the Son in his glorified state, are like prostrate before him, we can't even, the scripture says, he who stands in unapproachable light, referring to the Father, this human body can't even stand in the Father's presence.
Yeah.
we can somehow stand in the presence of the Son. You know, he has like a dimmer switch or something. I don't know how to describe it.
So
the Father, guys, gals, the Father has no dimmer switch.
Yeah. So Jacob, at some point, I really want to get Gary through some of the introductory stuff that he's doing. I really want him to do kind of an expository podcast through 1 Corinthians 15, which is really incredible, and culminating in this idea of the eighth day. My question for you is, at the beginning, you were thinking through a bit. You looked at the seven of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the 7 of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, but then you were thinking through this idea of the 40. You left that 40 number out there, and I don't think you ever came back to why the 40. Is this a generational thing? And because we know that 40 is an important number in the Bible, and we know that the wilderness wandering was this 40 years. Do you have any final thoughts on that, the 40 and the 7 number?
I do. So the 40 gets the emphasis for the Exodus, 40 years in the wilderness. The number that I think we should be paying more attention to is 42. 42 is the number of stops that were in the wilderness. So when you take a look at the importance of 42, let's pull it up here real quick. So if you have your phone with you, pull up your phone and do 42 months. And then if you take a look in the book of Revelation, the 42 months gets mentioned in Revelation 11:2, 13 and 13:5, but it gets mentioned as the 1,260 days. Because people wonder, well, why the Great Tribulation of 1,260 days? Again, God could pick any number he wants. But why is it 42 months? Well, in the context of Sukkot, they Sukkoted, if that's a word, they Sukkoted in the wilderness 42 months.
Yeah.
So at the end of days, you have 1,260 days, which translates into 42 months that the woman is in the wilderness at a place prepared by God for her. Isn't that interesting?
It is. And so you've calculated this, that 7 times 6 is 42. And then we've got 7 more puts us at 49 going into the 50th. You've calculated all this. Okay.
So there's this pattern that's doing its thing.
Okay.
It's there. It's these subtleties that when you start to look at the scriptures, you start to know what to look for. It's like a good investigator. Becoming a good investigator takes practice and it takes time, because a good investigator will not look at superfluous information. They're able to identify, and I'm not tooting my own horn here, and I'm not tooting your horn. This is what makes us better students of Messiah, is knowing what to look for. And when you look at this idea of Sukkoting, my firm opinion is we are going to be in the wilderness again. I don't know if it's our generation, but we're going to be in the wilderness again, and it is going to be a greater fulfillment of the Feast of Sukkot, because this time Yahweh says, you guys aren't even going to remember when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. What you're going to remember at the end is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of the north and out of the east and out of the west and out of the south, and brought you into your land. And so the ultimate fulfillment of Sukkot is this idea of coming completely or wandering in this life, right? There's going to be a greater exodus where we are all going to be in tents for 42 months, just like the children of Israel stopped at 42 places, except it's now the whole world. His elect are coming out, being drawn out, and being led to that same promised land.
Jacob, it's a big... We'll talk about that, just that part, on a whole other podcast. Friends, hey, friends, if you were in the middle of Sukkot and you were trying, Jacob and I applaud you. The reason we applaud you is that you are seeking to, not just be one who takes advantage of their faith. Even Bonhoeffer was against cheap grace, said, hey, yeah, we're saved by grace, but this should follow by a life that demonstrates that they are so in love with our Messiah. And I reflect on the psalmist, and I think it's Psalm 119, basically says, I am wiser than all my peers because I observe your Torah. I observe what God is doing. When you do this stuff, the Bible comes alive. You know your Messiah. You're able to instruct people. And here's the thing. If we are in end times, stuff going on here, COVID and what's going on in our world does seem a little bit, end timesy. If that's true, for you to instruct people that they might know what's going to happen, that they might, and I think more than anything, when that trumpet blasts and our Messiah returns, it's not all your knowledge of the eighth day. It's not all your knowledge of the things of Scripture. Will our Messiah find you and me and Jacob obedient? Yeshua said, if you love me, you'll obey my commandments. Will our bridegroom find us in love? And will our bridegroom find us, doing what we need to be doing that demonstrates that we are a bride in waiting? That's what we're about. Hey, if you're a believer, you want to be like our Messiah. Our Messiah followed that Torah every day of his life. He lived it. He embodied it. He projected it. He wanted his disciples to be a part of it. And that's what we want to be like Jesus. We want to be faithful disciples, and we're going to follow that Torah every day of our lives. And that's why we call it Everyday Torah. We'll see you next time.